morning. Welcome to Fraserview Church online service. We are going to be exploring the book of John over the next 4 weeks. Come and join us. We're going to have some interaction, some questioning, and an opportunity for you to think about how it relates to your life. If you are looking for more information and resources, check below. You will see some information, or check our website, Instagram, Facebook. If you have not signed up for our weekly email where lots of information will be coming your way, you can sign up for that on the website at fraserviewchurch.com. We look forward to you being a part of our journey through this COVID-19 pandemic, and we continue to want to do church together. So we love you, looking forward to connecting with you. Wash your hands, don't touch your face, and keep some social distance. Thank you. John 18, verses 1 to 9. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus knew all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said, and Judas, the traitor, was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me."
Great. The first thing I notice when I read John's account of Jesus' arrest is that it describes Jesus as going across the Kidron Valley from Jerusalem to a garden on the opposite side of the valley. We often conflate these things. We think of the Garden of Gethsemane as being on the Mount of Olives, but in fact that is the putting together of all four of the gospel stories. So Matthew and Mark tell us that Jesus goes to Gethsemane, which means in Aramaic an oil press. And Luke tells us it's on the Mount of Olives. And what we can get from John is that it happens in a garden. And obviously all these go together. We can imagine a garden of olive trees with an oil press at its center. This is Passover time, so probably lots of people come and camp in the garden while they're in Jerusalem for the festival. But I think John is intentional. He's probably read Matthew, Mark, and Luke calling it a garden. He does that for a reason. And I think he's thinking about another famous garden story. If you're familiar with the scriptures, you know that there's a garden right at the beginning, a garden in which there's a tree of life at its center. And to get to that tree of life, the human pair have to pass by the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. And this is the one tree that they're told not to eat from. And so I think for the purposes of the Genesis 2 and 3 story, the two trees provide a form of a test or a trial which faces every human. Will I eat of the tree of life, or will I eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad? Or to state it another way, will I accept God's instruction about what makes up a good life, or will I make my own decisions about what is good and bad for my life? So John, it's interesting. Again, I think he's read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and he doesn't tell us what occurs in the garden for Jesus. But those stories recount the fact that Jesus wrestles with God's instruction for his life. Jesus successfully follows and trusts God where the first humans fail. And because of Jesus' success, we all get to wrestle with the question of, will we follow and trust God's way over our own way? So the question I would like you to consider, and if you're at home you can pause the video here, does it encourage you that Jesus also had to wrestle with being faithful? And how does that encourage you?
You wanna go?
Sure. So for me, absolutely it encourages me. I think this points to some of the significance of the incarnation and why I love this part of the Christian story so much. This shows us that Jesus was so entrenched in the world that the God of heaven and earth really put himself in our position. This action of being fully man as well as fully God. I think it provides so much comfort to know that our God has experienced the same wrestling with being faithful that we often do as well. For me, this provides a sense of reality in my prayer life. It means when I pray and when I bring things to God that are real things that cause anxiety and genuine concern, I know that I'm not praying to an unsympathetic God. Stories like this in the Bible show me that when I pray, I'm praying to a God that knows the difficulty of humanity, a God that knows the wrestling it takes to remain faithful and who knows how hard it is to sometimes follow. This level of real incarnation is so indicative of the human nature of God in Jesus, and that gives me a lot of hope.
So when I think about the fact that Jesus had to wrestle with being faithful, does it give me hope? I think that I often hear Christians say that I just need to trust, to have faith, that everything will work out exactly as it's supposed to work out, and that whatever happens is God's will. So when I make my own decisions about what is good and what is bad, when I do what gives me satisfaction, what props me up, what makes me feel successful, when I fall into that humanness and belief that I'm responsible for my own life, I come out on the other side actually chastising myself for not having enough faith, for failing to believe that Jesus has this all under control, that he is the sole director of my life, and I feel that strongly. So I consciously have to work to push back on that reaction, because I truly do have confidence that this self-defeating message that I'm sending myself is not actually from my Lord, that in my humanness, I know I will fall short of the glory of the Lord, that I will wrestle with being faithful probably all my life. And I have great confidence that Jesus knows this too, that he too wrestled with being faithful in the Garden of Gethsemane. The confidence I feel knowing that Jesus can relate to me in these moments of struggle brings me incredible peace, to know that I'm not alone in this wrestling, that I have my great King and leader to show me that this is the real part of being human. So I find great shalom and peace with knowing that he too wrestled, and that I will continue to wrestle, and yet through all of that he will love me.
So the second thing I notice in this passage, John 18, 1-9, is the focus on Jesus' identity. They're always asking this question, who is this man? And you'll notice that it's Jesus who goes out of the garden and he initiates his arrest and he controls his arrest. John is trying to make that point very clearly. And so Jesus goes out and he asks, who is it that you want? And we should notice their response. They are looking for Jesus of Nazareth. They're looking for a troublemaker from Nazareth, just a guy who is of no special concern to them. And Jesus responds with the language, I am he. And those arresting him fall to the ground. So what's going on here? I am is a key term in John's gospel. He uses it at key moments to speak of Jesus' identity. And as an image of the garden, it draws on an Old Testament heritage. I am is the name of God gives himself in Exodus 3:14. So John uses it to speak frequently of Jesus' identity throughout his gospel. You probably know the phrases, I am the light of the world, I am the bread of life, I am the door, I am the good shepherd, I am the resurrection and the life, I am the way, truth, and life, I am the true vine. So Jesus then repeats the question, they repeat their response, and Jesus heads off with them, having ensured that the other disciples will be okay. So what we've seen is that Jesus wrestled with God in the garden, he has made his decision about what God requires of him, and then he goes out to action that desire. And the people who are coming to arrest him claim that Jesus is just a troublesome man. despite all the evidence of the contrary that has gone on in Jesus' life. But Jesus is claiming to be something much more significant, and John is writing this because of his claim that Jesus is something much more significant than that. And so the question for us, I think, is, how have you wrestled with following Jesus? What was the outcome of that wrestling? And now you can discuss that with people you are watching this video with.
So for me, I've wrestled with following Jesus, as anyone has, through some of the things he has called me to. I can't pretend to say I've been called to anything as intense as Jesus had in this passage, but I think that God has a way of calling people into things that are outside of their comfort zone. Last year, I found God calling me to move to Richmond, an area I didn't know anyone in or really anything about, but after I started working here and my wife got accepted into a school program in Richmond, KPU, it felt like God confirming that calling to be closer to here. While that means downsizing to a smaller place to live on our budget and creating some distance from the friends I made in Abbotsford where I lived before, I see a ton of different ways the work that God is doing on me, but also the ways that he is getting to work through me. It was a hard move to make, and still being an hour away from my family, let alone, Alyssa's family who lives in Calgary. And while moving here seemed to be where God was calling us to be, there were a lot of sacrifices involved along the way. Of course, the fruit of that has been amazing to see, and it's been amazing to grow in this community of faith and begin to connect with the people here at Fraserview.
I'd say the biggest wrestling that I've been involved in is the dynamic of teaching at Langara or working here. I believe that I default to an I can do it all kind of attitude, and I would continue to push my agenda forward and continue to teach at Langara and work here half-time, part-time, which always turned out to be much more than full-time at both places. I kept thinking that I was needed, that I could do it all, that if I didn't stay at Langara and didn't stay here at the same time, that I would be letting people down. And that's something that I really wrestle with in myself, is this fear of letting people down. So the result of all of that challenge in my life was a complete mental, emotional, physical exhaustion and some pretty serious family dysfunction because I had no time for anybody. I knew that something had to change, but yet I didn't have this mountaintop moment where God boomed down in his big voice and said, do this. And I really wish I had that, but I didn't have that. Instead, I had this deep underlying understanding that I needed to be here. And it was hard to admit that that was really what I needed to do. But I had to believe that that was God speaking to me and helping me through that wrestling and saying, no, Lou, you need to make a decision. You need to do something. And so taking a leave of absence from Langara was this opportunity for me to actually listen to what God was saying to me for so long and to rest in assurance that he was guiding me in this decision. What I'm learning is that God is really patient with me, that through this wrestling, he has continued to just give me this deep, I can't even explain, underlying feeling that this is where I need to be, even when things are really difficult in being a pastor. I had this moment, I had this physical feeling of, that I can breathe when I actually made that decision, when I signed the paper to say, I'm taking this leave of absence. I'm no longer committed to Langara for that term. I felt like I could breathe. I felt like this weight was lifted off of my shoulders, and that I could begin to understand what God's rest actually meant and the power of his rest for me so that I could be a better pastor and a better wife and a better mother and just be better, just be more well. So I definitely have wrestled with Jesus, and I'm a stubborn person, and I finally listened to that underlying deep feeling, and I'm very thankful that I did.
So in the first garden, the humans were tempted to question God's goodness and his power to supply them with the life that they kind of wanted. So what we see them do is that instead of trusting the tree of life, which would eventually cause them to grow up into people who are fully human, they decided they knew a shortcut. And their shortcut was to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. And so in that decision, they reject the tree of life, and so they receive death. And so what we see that happens in the first garden is that it's a place where death was born out of life. And so John's claim is that Jesus is more than a man from Nazareth. He is a fully human one who is living in the full goodness and power of God. And Jesus accepts the full weight of this identity in the garden, that he must trust God's goodness and power even if it involves death. And so he goes out of the garden into the darkness to be arrested. And so the second garden becomes this place where life was born out of death. And so for us, we're invited to return and to eat from the tree of life. And this is a constant decision that we have to make in many big and little ways throughout our life. Except now the tree of life has become Jesus. So when we choose to follow him and to trust him, then we are filled with his new life, which we'll get to in a few weeks with his resurrection. The life which was intended by God from the beginning is now returned to us in his victory over death. And so our lives are filled with those moments when we have to ask ourselves, do we want to go our own way, or do we want to trust in Jesus' way? Do we want death or life? And so hopefully we're all trying to push on that element of having faith, of having believing allegiance in who Jesus is, and we're pursuing after him day by day. So the question that I have for you is, where in your life do you need to trust in Jesus' goodness and power today?
Should I start again?
Yes.
Sure. So, where do I need to trust in Jesus' goodness and power? I said in everything, really. I need to trust in Jesus' goodness and power every day in all the things that I do. I think recently with the COVID-19 outbreak, it takes a lot to trust in the goodness and the power of Jesus in these times in particular. But I think that a massively important distinction is that trusting in Jesus doesn't mean the absence of action. I know that I can fully trust in the power of Jesus while still social distancing and doing everything that medical professionals are telling me to. I think that I need to trust more that Jesus will show himself, but also that truly trusting in Jesus means that I need to act as well. A lot of the time, trusting in Jesus' power means trusting in the professionals that are appointed into their positions who know how to handle these situations. And I think that trusting in Jesus' goodness and power often means that I need to trust that I have the ability to contribute something as well. And so trusting that Jesus will work through me as well.
I think for me, it's trusting in Jesus' goodness and power is really strongly standing on the foundation that this is God's church. That Jesus wants Fraserview to flourish. He wants his people, all of us, to spread the good news of his life and his resurrection power, and that we are here to facilitate that. As pastors, we are perhaps the hands and feet and maybe the voice of that mission. But I know that I need to work carefully at making sure that I can care for his people during this time, that's what he has called me to do. But also to step back and understand that this church is not going to flourish because of me. That it is not something that I own, that I am solely responsible for. I need to trust that together as a team, we can care for the people in this church, but that it is actually all of us, the family of God, who need to care for each other. And I'm seeing beautiful examples of that, just communicating with people through this COVID-19 pandemic, the people who are stepping up and saying, if you need somebody to go grocery shopping for the seniors, let me know, I'm available. We've got people who are cooking meals, we're freezing meals ready to go for others. People caring for driving others around. So I'm seeing how we are coming together as a church, and it's so humbling for me to see the church come together, and that his power and his goodness is so apparent during this time. So I feel really honored to be part of this journey with Jesus in his church, and to be a member of Fraserview's family.
Thank you for joining us this morning in our scripture reflection. We are going to finish by reading the prayer of containment that Stacey wrote. We'll have included a copy in the email that has gone out and on the website. Let us pray. When we are tempted to be fearful, teach us peace. When we are tempted to hoard, teach us generosity. When we want to look only to the well-being of our own family, teach us to expand our care.
When we become overwhelmed and disengaged, teach us to feel the pain of others. When we are financially unstable, teach us to find ways to live smaller. When we are disappointed, teach us joy in sacrifice.
When we are tempted to despair, teach us to remember that you are still God and that you are still good. When we think we know it all, teach us to listen harder. When we struggle to decide what to do in small ways, teach us to pray for those in positions of authority.
When we are tempted to despise the action of others, teach us to see behind foolishness and negative behavior to the hurt beneath. When we respond to rising tension in haste and without consideration, teach us patience.
When we are tempted to blame others, teach us to have grace for decisions made in a time of fluctuating information and changing conditions. When we are isolated, teach us to find ways to connect with you and with others. When we feel bored, teach us to expand our creativity.
When we feel alone, teach us to ask for help. When we feel strong, teach us to care for those who are not. When we are tempted to despondency, teach us to see all the varied goodness that surrounds us.
When we are tempted to be careless, teach us to see each action we take as resonating in the lives of others. When we feel we can do nothing, teach us how very wrong we are.
Above all this, teach us to love, now more than ever. Amen.
Well, thank you for joining us this morning. We remind you to keep in touch with each other. The longer this social isolation goes on, the lonelier we get. So use your text messages and phone calls to speak to each other and to encourage each other. Please do let us know if you need anything from us. You can contact us on our emails, and we are happy to go and get groceries for people, or go to the pharmacy if you are scared to go out, or if you need to be self-isolating. And we remind you to keep in contact with our webpage and our email as we let you know the other things that are going on. So stay safe and wash your hands. God bless.